created by Henry VIII as his home. To our eyes, it's a perfect example of a typical Tudor palace. But perhaps it isn't. We see it as Henry's greatest legacy to the nation. Well, maybe it's not that either. Henry VIII was the most prolific builder in the history of the monarchy. He built 5 major palaces, 4 of which have disappeared. And in this Time Team special, we've been given unique access to explore the sites of all 5. We've got a rare chance to dig at the site of the first palace ever built by Henry, Beaulieu Palace.
We've just got to find out just how big it really is. And I think it is going to be big.
We travel across Europe to discover what inspired Henry.
Cool. It's a bit dramatic, isn't it?
And what you're
We burrow under the centre of London.
Oh, look at that. Look, come down here. That is quite extraordinary.
And we dig at Hampton Court itself, unpicking the work done there by Henry.
We've got to dig a hole, see if there's anything there. We've got to follow those hints.
In this very special film, we'll reveal Henry VIII's legacy to this country. Of course, he gave us Hampton Court, but he gave us much more besides. And by digging up some of his long-forgotten palaces, by looking at the work that he did there, and by tracing the influences on Henry, we'll discover a man unlike the one you thought you knew.
We see why Henry was known as Henry the Great.
In 1509, Henry VII died, and Henry, his son, became Henry VIII. His accession marked a major change in the story of the monarchy. Henry VII could be said to be the last of the great medieval kings. Henry VIII shifted it from the medieval to the modern. And this massive change can be seen most vividly in the buildings that he created.
He aspires to be a great patron of the arts and builder, and it's his palaces which are the great symbol of that. And the fact that some of those palaces still survive 500 years on is a testimony to just how much he achieved in that line.
He just built so much. And also the palaces he did build, many of them were just so enormous that you would have been just overwhelmed by the scale, let alone by anything else.
It's a shame that he's known principally for the fact that he managed to get himself 6 wives, because it tends to obscure the complexity of the fellow. At the time of his death, he's given the title Henry the Great. He's seen as a great builder and renovator of architecture.
Henry was born in 1491, so was just 18 when he became king. He inherited several palaces, including Greenwich and Richmond. But at the age of 25, he decided he wanted to build himself something modern. That palace has gone now, demolished. But this school in Essex is on the site.
The palace that Henry built here was his first, and it started an obsession with building that carried on for the next 30 years. This is New Hall School in Chelmsford, a building that sits on the footprint of Henry's original one. He built it in 1517, but at the time he already had 2 sumptuous places just outside London, in Richmond and Greenwich. So what did he want here?
Henry called his new palace Beaulieu, beautiful place. The name expressed his desire for fine things. Just outside Chelmsford, it was a day's ride from London and the East Coast.
The whole of England faced east until Henry VIII's time, because we're trading over the Baltic with Germany, and so the East Coast ports like Hull and then Harwich, not far away, were major centres. Now, to be between the capital and the eastern coastal ports was a good place to be. Essex had good flat hunting ground, so it wasn't a bad place to live at all.
What did it look like?
The first plans we have are 100 years after Henry left. So there is no drawing that shows us what he saw. We have to work it all out. Pretty sure that the entrance gateway was built by him. Also sure that he built a new set of lodgings. But once you get through the gatehouse into this area, it's all to play for.
Very little archaeology has ever been done on this site, so we've got a rare chance to look at an original Tudor palace. The building that Henry erected here has gone. This school was put up on the same site. We've got some much later images and a plan of what's supposed to be Henry's palace, but we simply don't know if they're accurate. They've never been tested. But we've done some geophysics, and there's a clear target over what's marked on the plan as the gatehouse.
You can see quite clearly one tower, entrance through the middle, and then the second tower.
Yeah, I can
But
see
look,
that.
we've got the one tower here. It extends back something like this.
Yeah.
So you've got the tower there, the actual entrance coming through here.
Okay.
And then, well, another tower here. I mean, it basically lines up with the doorway you can see.
Yeah.
I mean, I reckon once you peel off the turf, you know, you're going to be straight onto the archaeology.
No one's ever dug this gatehouse before. If we find it and it marries up with the later plans, it'll help prove they're accurate. And John was right. We hit archaeology straight away.
Yeah, that is plummeting on down there, look. We just got to now find out just how big it really is. I know you think it is going to be big.
Within a few hours, Phil's taken this a lot further, and he's got the foundations of a substantial-looking gateway.
You seem to have quite a lot of wall. Is it Tudor, Phil?
It is Tudor and it is the gateway. Where I'm standing is the turret of the gateway, and over underneath that spoil tip there we've got the other turret. And if you come round here, you can actually see, look straight down the avenue. The gapway between those two buttresses, which is the gateway, goes straight down the avenue, straight into the main entrance of the school.
While Henry was busy building Beaulieu in Essex, on the other side of London, Hampton Court was taking shape. At the time, it was owned by this man, Cardinal Wolsey, Henry's right-hand man, his Lord Chancellor, the second most important man in the country. When Wolsey bought Hampton Court, it was simply a small manor house, one that Henry visited often. The two men were close.
They have a genuine relationship, and it spans across all kinds of issues. It's not just, politics and administration. That they spend a lot of time together, and I think there's no doubt that Wolsey is a very great influence on awakening the kind of instincts which Henry VIII himself has.
The building projects during Wolsey's period of time are very much something that both of them do. Wolsey does the administration, organises it in a way that Henry does more later after Wolsey, but that actually during that period of time it is a question of them working together.
Wolsey enlarged his manor house by attaching a large accommodation block to it called Base Court. Behind those walls is a corridor linking all the guest rooms, which, believe it or not, was revolutionary.
Ken, you talk about revolutionary building design, but all I can see is a half-timbered corridor.
Well, that's the revolution, is having the corridor.
Why do you say that?
Well, you have to remember where we are. We're standing within Base Court, so that large quadrangle that when you arrive at court, you sort of first enter and where you're received at Wolsey's court and at Henry VIII's court.
So that's out there?
So that's just out there.
And the big quadrangle all the way around?
Yeah, and then off all those corridors are two-room apartments. So you arrive as a nobleman at Henry VIII's court, you bring your own retinue and you have to be sort of put up. And when you come here, you're put up in the lap of luxury.
Why is a corridor so revolutionary?
Because normally you would have had sort of lodgings arranged around a courtyard for visitors to court or visitors to a nobleman's house. But each one would have had their own door. So you would have just sort of arrived and sort of gone in, whereas here...
Oh, I see. This is much more like... it's like a monastery with the corridor all round it, except it's sealed off.
Yeah. So this means that you can get from your apartment to anywhere else, more or less anywhere else in the palace, especially to the dining hall, to all where sort of the great feasts and receptions are held, without going out into the harsh English climate.
It's a premier travelling.
Absolutely.
Having a corridor inside was way ahead of its time. It was the very latest idea, symptomatic of a new concept, comfort. So the new Tudor palaces sprouted loads of chimneys, the clue to there being lots of fireplaces and the luxury of being warm.
the fact that Henry VIII in particular had all the latest in building and the latest in silverware and latest in clothes, that wasn't just because he was the sort of person who liked that kind of thing. It was because you had to have all that kind of thing to show that you were the leader of society. It was a political statement as much as anything.
People want lovely rooms with carpets and tapestries and things like that, and glazing. You know, a lot of the technology means that some of these houses are now possible. But the main thing is that you don't need any more to have something with a moat round it, which you can defend in time of need. The previous big building programmes, and perhaps, you can look at, the arrival of William the Conqueror, when there's a lot of castles built, because you need to have the castles to hold down England. With Henry at a time of peace, you go like, OK, what do we want now? We want houses and palaces.
One such house was at Beaulieu, where Phil's making good progress looking for the gatehouse. Beaulieu Palace was to be a family home, as Henry lived there with his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. At the time it was built, Catherine gave birth to a baby girl. All that remains of it now above ground is a huge crest that sits inside the New Hall School chapel. We know that this was attached to the gatehouse that Phil's digging. There's a much later drawing where the crest can be seen.
Phil, that coat of arms is pretty big. It kind of implies that this gatehouse must have been massive.
It really was massive, Tony. I mean, the trench that we've got here just scratches the surface. And in fact, it doesn't really address the gatehouse at all. All we've really excavated is the gateway. The gatehouse goes literally out to those trees over there. In fact, where the barrow is one side. The walls of the gatehouse were absolutely massive. And if you look over here, we can actually show just how big this thing was, because the main turret is going to go in there, and at the back here you can see we've got this massive octagonal stairwell. Where we've plotted our walls onto the mapping, they coincide exactly, and where we've plotted them with the geophysics, they coincide exactly at all. So this is not a figment of imagination. This is it's a massive stairwell in here. The front literally goes out to that ha-ha there. It is enormous.
Jonathan, I think Phil used the word massive about 4 times there. But from the archaeology, all we know is that it's massive this way. But that doesn't mean that it was particularly impressive going up that way, does it?
It was a big-shouldered square thing, and this 18th century view shows exactly what it looked like to any visitor. And there's the King's arms, almost dwarfed.
This is our coat of arms from inside.
Exactly, but this is the narrow side. In fact, this internal face is broader still. On any scale of Tudor gatehouses, this is a whopper.
But couldn't it have been rather like a 1930s cinema, that you've got this elegant facade, but behind it you've got nothing more than a prefab?
It did happen in some Tudor houses. You've got the promise here of great glazed interiors, these fabulous chimneys showing people are kept warm in comfort. But this site delivers. Go through that gatehouse, and this is what you see. That, in fact, forms just a small part of not just one courtyard, but what contemporaries describe as being a complex of 8 courtyards with all the paraphernalia for royal entertainment.
The brickwork in here is early Tudor. This gatehouse sits exactly on the plans we have, which proves that this is indeed a plan of what Henry built. With 8 courtyards, Beaulieu Palace was huge, a magnificent palace. Henry had started the way he meant to go on. His buildings reflected his personality.
Henry's buildings say what things like the Holbein picture of him say, which is a sense of his own grandeur. He dressed himself magnificently, he had extraordinary tapestries. His buildings are a similar symbol of what life should be like for him as a king and what he wanted to say about himself.
What Henry wanted to say was, I'm rich, I'm powerful, and I'm here to stay. His next palace was his most audacious, built solely to impress his neighbour. The extraordinary palace at the Field of Cloth of Gold.
If you love what we do, become a Time Team member today. You'll get behind-the-scenes footage, ad-free viewing, and special masterclasses with the team. We'd love to have you on
This is Newhall School in Chelmsford, site of the first major palace built by Henry VIII. We've got drawings of what it looked like and we've got plans, but they're all from a much later period than when Henry was here. What they don't tell us is where Henry himself would actually have lived. And Stuart, in order to try and find that out, you want us to dig not over there, but here in the gardens. Would these have been gardens during Henry's time?
If we interpret these plans properly, we're standing on the edge of this range here. You can see these fancy bay windows all along here. We're literally standing on the edge of those, looking out onto what would have been gardens in Henry's period, extending up that slope. Very extensive layout of gardens. You have this fancy architecture along this facade. It's the sort of privacy and lovely view you'd expect, the sort of place a king might be.
Do you think Stuart's right? Could this have been the king's quarters?
I think Stuart's working on the principle of feng shui rather than anything. You expect high status in a palace. It's got to show off this first courtyard. But the way in which Tudor palaces are normally organised is you come through the gatehouse, you go through the Great Hall on the far side of the lawn, and then up to the royal apartments.
So Stuart thinks the king might have lived here, you think way over there.
Yeah.
But suppose Stuart's right, suppose the king did live here, how would we prove it?
There are very few references to what this was like in Henry's day. None of the plans show the layout accurately, but we do hear a reference to the king having a bath, a great sunken bath. And from Hampton Court we know that the king's bath was heated by almost a furnace at ground floor, pumping up the hot water. So basically, water heating.
So put in a trench and look for the plumbing.
Yeah, that's essentially it.
So Jonathan thinks the royal apartments were here, underneath the existing building, and Stuart thinks they're here, in the front garden. Geophysics have given us a couple of targets in the area that Stuart's interested in, so that's where we start work. While Beaulieu was being built, Henry didn't have a problem with where to stay. Like all previous kings, he already had a couple of big palaces. Greenwich Palace, Richmond, not to mention Windsor Castle. And like all monarchs before him, Henry didn't stay long in one place.
For a Tudor monarch, there was a big difference between summer and winter. In the winter, you didn't travel very far. You essentially kept your court moving between the really big palaces on the River Thames. So you'd be oscillating between Richmond, Hampton Court, Greenwich. And in the summer, you adopted a completely different pattern. You set off from the Thames Valley and you would go much further afield.
Kings and queens have always travelled around the country. Traditionally, in the medieval period, it was a chance to clean the palace, pump out the loos, that kind of thing. And wherever the monarch travelled to, they'd give it a fresh lick of paint, generally tarted up a bit. Although here in Gloucestershire, one man went just a little bit further. This is Acton Court, home of the Poyns family. And in 1535, when Henry planned to come here and stay a couple of nights, Lord Poyns had that entire wing built just to accommodate the king.
As Acton Court shows, the nobility would go to great lengths to welcome royalty, so at first, like previous kings, Henry expected people to put him up as he toured the country. But he didn't want to depend on others, so he began a lifelong spending spree accumulating his own houses.
Henry's palaces tell us a good deal about his kingship in terms of their sheer number. Henry VIII owned 55 palaces or hunting lodges by the time of his death. No English monarch before or since has owned so many palaces.
If you look at what Henry VII did, he spent a huge amount of his time staying with his courtiers, staying particularly with the abbots and the bishops. Henry VIII is totally different. Henry VIII wants to stay in his own house.
In his own house at Beaulieu, our dig's going well. In this trench, we're looking for the remains of what might be the royal apartments. The geophysics have been fairly clear.
Yeah. And the detail is so good, you can actually see the individual...
Big bay windows.
Bay windows,
yeah.
According to the radar, King Henry should have been stood here looking out of the bay window. Were we right?
Yes, you were right. There's a bay window just here. You can see this circular shape. That's one over there. Helen is actually uncovering another bay window over there.
Just exactly where John had predicted. What we're seeing at Beaulieu Palace is the scale of the design. It's grand, a big wing, a huge gatehouse. Even at the age of 25, Henry surrounded himself with splendour and wanted to impress his subjects. But he also wanted to impress on a wider stage. So his second palace was a very different beast altogether, an audacious piece of political and actual engineering.
In the year 1520, Henry VIII of England met Francis I of France. The meeting took place in France, but on a piece of land just outside Calais, which was in English hands. Henry saw the meeting as a chance to really show off to his powerful neighbour, and the way he organised the whole thing epitomised his love of ostentation. He turned up with an entourage of 5,000 people, most of whom were put up in highly decorated, beautifully painted tents. Observers of the scene were bowled over by it, so much so that it became known as the Field of Cloth of Gold.
The Field of Cloth of Gold was an extraordinary event, with jousting and feasting, the English mingling with the French. And Henry's arrival was spectacular.
His personal retinue for the Field of Cloth of Gold, which is probably exceptional, but that's 3,997 people and about 2,000 horses. And then his wife has about 1,100 people in her retinue. So put that all together and you're around about 5,000 people.
But the most remarkable part of the whole thing was this building. It was 300 foot long and 300 foot deep. A palace built for Henry's stay. A palace that was only built for the duration of the event. Just over 2 weeks.
It's on 2 levels. It's partly brick and timber construction on the ground floor, timber and canvas on the first floor, but with real glass in the windows, and designed to impress with its sheer scale, the cost of it, and its facilities. Of course, there's the fountains out the front of it, which supposedly flowed with white and or red wine when great events happened in the course of the 2 weeks. So it really was the technological marvel of the Field of Cloth of Gold.
It was painted to look like a Renaissance palace, and it had sumptuous rooms inside, a great hall, a chapel, I think decorated in blue with gold stars, and the dining hall had taffeta lining the floor, and there were rich colours, and it was an incredible building.
The great thing about it was that because it was a temporary structure, you could make it more fashionable than anything that appears to have been being built as a permanent structure at the English court. So you have this large classical style scalloped arch over the entrance gateway, classical style pillars, and so on.
This field, a few kilometres from Calais in northern France, is where the event took place. 10,000 people were here, staying in enormous tented pavilions, a sea of coloured gold cloth that gave the event its name, the Field of Cloth of Gold. Just beyond the field is the town of Guisnes, where Henry had his temporary palace built. It's a small market town now, with no hint of a palace in it. But we found where it stood. In the painting, we can see the castle gate, bystanders on the right, and the palace. Looking at the modern town plan, we've worked out that the castle gate would have sat here. The bystanders on the right were along here, where these houses are now, which means that the palace would have been somewhere in this area. We can reveal that this tatty bit of ground is the site of Henry's palace. Just here, Henry VIII built the most extraordinary, showy, pretentious palace imaginable. It was a warning to the rest of Europe. Don't mess with me.
It's about a display of wealth, it's about a display of loyalty from your subjects. The fact that you have lots of noblemen there who are all showing how loyal they are to you and how prepared they are to come with you to a peaceful event in France. So it's showing what you can do, what your country can do, how strong your monarchy is.
You think of all the comment about that the Bird's Nest Stadium at the Chinese Olympics. In a sense, it's a bit like that, technological marvel able to do what it's required to do. It's designed as a very, I was going to say concrete, but a timber and brick manifestation of Henry's wealth and sophistication.
This is the Great Lost Palace. It's easy to forget it. It was only up for a few weeks. It was about Henry VIII making his mark, marking the cards of the French. This was Henry at his most outrageous, big and bold. And over at Henry's first palace at Beaulieu in Essex, we've got more evidence that Henry went large even at a young age. Beaulieu was a big place with a huge gatehouse and 8 courtyards. It had an enormous crest on the gatehouse, marking Henry's territory. And we also now have some impressive windows. These are quarters fit for a royal.
You got some intriguing looking archaeology here, Matt.
Yeah, it's great, isn't it? We're standing inside the building, main back wall there, and can you see the slight curve in the bricks? That's where we'd had one of these large bay windows. And inside we've got this lovely brick floor here, and can you see the drainage channel sloping away from it down there? That's original.
We hadn't expected a floor like this. The drain suggests this is a kitchen or laundry, but it's a small one, and Jonathan has a theory about it.
I think this is too small an area for the king's quarters that would have included his bathroom. We've got a lot of small rooms on this ground floor area that shows its service, but the bay windows are for rooms above, which are rather grander. So an important person who needs a lot of activity to service them. And I think that this is a laundry area and maybe kitchens away from the main laundry and kitchens on the far side of the site for someone who needs extra care and attention. And it's this year, 1516, that young Princess Mary is born.
That's Henry's daughter who became Queen Mary.
Exactly, Bloody Mary, yeah. I think this is the nursery wing of the palace.
To have found this nursery floor is fantastic. With plague gripping London, keeping a young child out at the family home in Essex would have been a good decision. And we've also found an amazing clue that we're on the right lines. In this Aragonese pomegranate on the crest, it's got the usual display of seeds through a slit. But this one has a Tudor rose emerging from it, a clear symbol of the birth of a young Tudor, confirming that this palace is all about the issue of children.
By the 1520s, Henry had really got the building bug. He'd already built Beaulieu and his temporary palace in France, but now he started work on a new project, a massive palace that's still with us 500 years later.
Hampton Court Palace.
Darn me, that's impressive.
That's fantastic, isn't it? Really impressive.
You ever been here before?
No, I haven't. I mean, for me, it's too close to London, and I don't like London, so I've never been here.
You get the same disease that I got then. If it's inside the M25, you don't go there.
I think we can blame Henry VIII for that attitude, you know. He seems to have spent all his time in these palaces around London. Whereas the medieval kings had palaces all around the country. In the days before television and before things like heads on stamps, the only way people ever saw their monarch or their queen was if they perambulated around the country.
My fear, my hatred of London would probably mean that the only thing I'd ever have is me head on a block. I'm sure I would.
You and me both, Phil. You and me both.
This is amazing, though, isn't it?
It's huge. It's far bigger than I thought it was going to be.
Hampton Court was one of Henry's favourites. We think of it as his biggest monument, and we're getting the chance not just to excavate untouched parts of it, but also to touch the glamour that Henry brought to the place.
If you're enjoying this dig, why not take it one step further and become a Time Team member? It's your front row seat to the greatest show on earth and under it. Become a Time Team member today and help us keep the archaeology coming.
Hampton Court looks very different depending on where you approach it from. From this side, the east, it looks a bit like the Palace of Versailles, all straight lines and sharp angles. William III knocked down much of the Tudor palace and built this in its place. On the other side, though, is the Tudor part, largely built over a 30-year period. Over there, now long disappeared, was the tilt yard, where the jousting took place.
In its day, the tilt yard was absolutely huge. It stretched from right over there, where that wall is, down to there, where that wall is now, by where the big tree is. Not only that, it was out here too, right down to that wall, and over here down to that wall. Of course, none of those walls were here at the time, but what were here were 5 towers. 4 of them were demolished about 400 years ago. The other one is just there behind that cafe. And we've been given the unique opportunity to excavate the other 4. What we don't know is where they were or what they were used for.
This drawing of them is one clue we have as to where they might have been. We've done some geophysics and Stuart's done a full landscape survey. So where do we go from here?
Kent, surely somebody must have looked for these towers before.
Oh, they've always been a matter of real intrigue because they're so beautifully depicted in this Wingard view of about 1558. But people really haven't had the opportunity to do that, partly because this area has been so developed over the years, so it became gardens and kitchen gardens and was divided up by walls. And one has always survived, which is the one behind us, which became a cafe. And when that was extended, there was a little bit of work done over here behind the wall, and that showed up maybe a bit of wall in this area.
A bit of possibly tower wall.
But
Stuart, if we know they're here, shouldn't they be incredibly easy to find?
I would think so, wouldn't you? But if you look carefully at the bits on Wingard's drawings and you know there's architectural reality to it, and knowing that that's the one that's in the Tilt Yard Cafe at the moment, you can start to define where they ought to be. So what I've done is got my best guess, as it were, using all that information, where they might be within these compartments here.
John, we've got acres of lovely grass here. You've got solid archaeology. Surely this should be a doddle for geophys.
Well, that's the problem. Have we got solid archaeology? Geophysics can only detect what's surviving.
Do you mean some of this masonry might have been nicked?
Yes, it could easily have been robbed out, and with the sort of landscaping that's gone over the years, it's difficult to know what we're looking at. But we have got some positive results. I mean, here, close to where we stood now, you can see the possible footprint of a tower. The suggestions are definitely there, but taken as a whole, I mean, to be honest, we've only really got hints of what might be there.
What are we going to do, Mick?
I think we've got to look at the hints, you know, we've got to look at the geophys purple areas where they tie up with Stuart's suggestions. We've got to dig a hole, see if there's anything there. We've got to follow those hints.
So we explore 3 areas. Under the patio, where a bit of wall had been found before. On the lawn opposite the standing tower. And along a wall joined to the standing tower. This will take quite a bit of unpicking.
These little towers in the Tilt Yard.
Yeah.
What on earth are they for, Kent?
The 2 easiest ones, I think, are these 2, and you see they sort of mirror each other.
Yeah.
Here and here, and they sit within the wall, and they probably mark the entrance into the tilt yard because you see there's no wall between them.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe also changing rooms for the 2 teams. So if you're jousting or you're in a mock battle, then you have 2 teams who are competing one against the other. So that might explain those.
Tudor changing rooms then is one possibility.
And
right?
then you've got this amazing one in the middle. So it shows off the sort of magnificence of the palace. And it clearly had amazing views out over the estate and also out over whatever is going on around it.
So are they partly viewing platforms?
It's possible Henry is watching and his leading courtiers are watching the battles. They're probably being served really remarkable food.
Right.
Sort of amazing nibbles.
Yeah.
And that might be being cooked here because we've got this very big fireplace.
It's all like theatre, isn't it, really?
It is. It's a theatre of war, and it's tied up with this whole idea of chivalry and courtly love, and it's played out here. And this is what Hampton Court is all about. It's a palace of pleasure.
Across a 30-year period, the Tudor part of Hampton Court burst into life. Cardinal Wolsey had extended the original manor house by adding this huge accommodation block, Base Court. Henry took things a lot further, starting in 1529.
Over the next 15 years, Henry turned this place upside down. His very first actions defined his intentions. Behind this wall is Base Court, the luxury lodgings built by Wolsey. Very nice, very genteel. But as soon as Henry got here, he started building from there in that direction. And it's all kitchens.
The kitchens were a big part of this new palace of pleasure. These kitchens were designed to feed up to 1,000 people at a time. Henry planned entertainment on a lavish scale. Sorting the kitchens out was his first priority. But his work on the kitchens was just the beginning. For the next 15 years, Henry was obsessed with building at Hampton Court Palace. He kept adding to it. He wanted it to be magnificent. He wanted it to impress. He wanted the best of everything. And after the kitchens, he turned here to his next big change, the enormous and magnificent Great Hall.
We're in the Great Hall of Hampton Court Palace, the most magnificent Tudor space in the entire country. But if you think that's exciting, take a look at those. These are the Abraham tapestries. They're called that because they tell the story of the biblical hero Abraham. And believe it or not, apart from the crown jewels, those are the most valuable historical artefacts in the entire country, which may seem a bit surprising. After all, they do look a bit faded and manky, don't they? Certainly compared with the glories of the ceiling. But if you look closely, those threads are made of silver and gold.
The thing that's really, really important is textile. And supreme amongst all the textiles were the tapestries. These were hugely, hugely valuable artifacts. And putting them into a sort of modern context, a set of tapestries would cost the same amount as a warship. So Henry VIII had a choice of building a warship like the Mary Rose or ordering a set of tapestries.
By the end of his life, Henry had 600 tapestries. I mean, an average nobleman might have 50. It's on a lavish scale. So it would have just been a sense of awe at the magnificence and splendour of this king, which is what it's all about.
What would this room have looked like when these tapestries were in their glory?
It would have absolutely shone, basically. So the gold and silver thread in the tapestries would have shone, and where you see the red and the blue still quite clear, all the other colours in the tapestries, the greens, the yellows, the whites and the blacks would have been that vivid. So it would have been like having a sort of HD television sort of all around you. And then the floor wouldn't have been the sort of plain wooden floor, it would have been a tiled floor with large, almost certainly green and white tiles. So you've got that sort of glistening beneath you, and then above, the wonderful ceiling, not the oak and gilt colour that it is today, but painted blue. Bice is the word that they use. So that would have sort of shone back down. So you would have been surrounded by colour. So it's a complete immersive experience.
The tapestries as they are today don't fill the room full of colour. But conservators have devised a way of shining lights onto a tapestry, each beam corresponding to a single original colour. And the result is that the tapestries would actually have looked like this. Putting this with the coloured ceiling and floor, we get an idea of how this great hall would have looked.
These palaces were garish, and we, if we went into them now, would think this is pretty ghastly. I mean, nouveau riche is the word that some people have used to describe it. I mean, gold, anything that could be gilded probably was. Very bright colours, primary colours, blues, reds. These are textiles shot through with gold thread and silver thread, very, very bright, vivid coloured silks. You're entering a world of colour, you're entering a world of sensory overload, if you like.
Over at the tilt yard, in our search for the missing towers, we're getting mixed results. We put trenches in alongside this wall, under this patio, and here on the lawn, where Matt is struggling.
So did we get this tower then, Matt?
Well, it's not looking great. I mean, we positioned this trench here because the geophysics showed an anomaly.
Yeah.
And the sketches and the views showed something in approximately this area, but look, we opened this huge trench, and we're down onto the natural sand there, and there's no sign of any walls. The closest we've got, really, is this line of rubble along here.
Oh, well, this red stuff all along here?
Yeah, if you go all the way along here, in fact, if you look where Jacek's digging here,
yeah,
we took the opportunity to push the trench just in that direction. You can see it coming around there, and he appears to have a cut or something across the bottom.
I mean, it looks as if you've got a lot of bricks in the bottom there, including one of those vitrified bricks they make the patterns up with in the walls.
Yeah.
So you're thinking there's a wall under that path?
Yeah, we've just caught the edge of it here. It's going out that way.
And we can't get at that?
No.
At the patio, we're not having much luck either. There's nothing here. No sign of any walls. Our best hope at this stage is alongside the wall connected to the one remaining tower.
So where are we on the print then, Kent?
Well, what we hope is that we're here. So if you remember over here, we have the Tiltyard Tower that survives. It's now our cafe.
Yeah.
And what that seems to do is to mark the entrance into the Tiltyard. So the wall comes up on this side and that side, but there's nothing in the middle.
So how have you got on then, Rebecca?
The interesting stuff is this early wall that we've got the foundations for down the bottom here.
That rubble down there, Rebecca, I mean, it looks to me like very regular bricks and stone. Could that not be just foundations for this later garden wall?
Well, it's possible that that's foundations, but looking at it, the way that it's not actually evenly matched brick, it's sort of odds and sods, it looks like it's sort of been nibbled away and it's actually what's left from robbing of the earlier tower.
So how are you going to resolve that then?
I'm going to dig a big hole, sondage the middle and go down, basically.
Because presumably if it's the tower, it's going to have a massive foundation, whereas if it's just the garden wall, it's going to be relatively light, I would have thought.
If we find more of it, then we're looking at the tower. If we find less of it, then it's the garden wall.
The Tiltyard we're exploring at Hampton Court is one of many features Henry created to impress. He was desperate for the Tudors to be seen as the only rightful monarchs, steeped in the country's traditions.
There was a complete Tudor obsession with sort of chivalry and knights and shields and banners and beasts. Great passion for heraldry, displaying your coats of arms, your ancestors' coats of arms, your wife's coats of arms, your family's coats of arms. There was no way going into a Tudor palace that you could be under any illusion that you were in the palace of a very, very rich, very, very powerful man who knew what he wanted.
Henry knew exactly what he wanted. He wasn't just building for the sake of it, he was building to make a mark. Henry's father had stolen the throne and then his older brother Arthur had died, so Henry always felt the need to prove himself as king.
The propaganda messages of his father's court are being constantly pumped at Henry, even more than they would have been at Arthur, his elder brother, because Henry's there on the spot. And of course, those propaganda messages are all about how the Tudors have been providentially raised up as a dynasty by God to solve England's problems, the Tudor rose, the red rose and the white rose superimposed on each other to produce a new family that will end all England's problems. Now, of course, the problem with that, potentially from Henry's point of view, is that if he can't carry on that dynasty, then something must be terribly wrong. That's God's job for the Tudors, then why can't Henry do it? And probably that underlies some of Henry's frantic concern to have a son to carry on the family mission.
Showing the world he was in charge, showing everyone he meant business, demanded that the outside of Henry's palaces had to be as splendid as the inside.
Most people would have only passed Hampton Court by on the river, so even the outside had to look good. Not only were the bricks naturally red and black, but they were also painted black and red, and the mortar was outlined in white. And then it was surrounded all over with the most fabulous weather vanes all over the top that were gilded. And you can imagine how fabulous they would look on a sunny day. And of course, it was such a large place as well. You couldn't possibly miss it. The Thames was a bit like the M25 in those days, with lots of traffic up and down it. So plenty of people would have seen it. So it was a very, very solid way of saying, look, I'm here to stay, don't mess with me.
Henry worked on Hampton Court for 15 years, and in that time transformed it completely. He added all these kitchens and the Great Hall. He rebuilt the King's lodgings. In 1533, he built this wing as the Queen's new lodgings for Anne Boleyn. This was all added in 1537 for Jane Seymour.
If you look at the phases of building that happened at Hampton Court, most of them can be tied in with his marriages by building new suites of apartments for the latest queen, but also making provision for children he either hoped to have or he actually had.
And just after the birth of Henry's son Edward, these 5 towers were built in the tilt yard. After 3 days' worth of digging, we now have got some positive results. We found a lot more than we dared hope for.
Oh, that's good. That's great, isn't it?
What do you mean that's good?
Well, we were hoping to get great deep foundations, weren't we?
Well, it's our foundation wall for the tower that we were looking for.
Yeah.
Why do you think that might be the tower wall, Rebecca?
Well, we said yesterday that if it was the foundation for the tower, it would be going down and fairly substantial, as opposed to being a fairly slim garden wall foundation. And yes, there's a lot more of it.
But do you think it still might be going under this building behind the wall?
I think it's likely. I think this sort of more recent house is actually put on the former footprint of the old tower.
In other words, you think it's facing that way rather than that way towards Phil?
Yeah, I think there's a lot more tower sort of behind me this way.
Under the building covered by this red roof sat one of the missing towers. This stonework is the only evidence left that it was here, but it's enough. And over at Matt's trench, we've got more good news. He's found a wall, albeit just a small part of one.
This is a bit of a triumph, isn't it? That's definitely a tower.
Oh yeah, I mean it's only a tiny bit of it, but it shows that we're on the site of where this tower was. I think the whole thing's worked actually, because I mean that one's still there, and of course the one under the wall, which is where the red roof cottage is, that's another one. And because we know the positions of those, I think we can say that the middle one must be somewhere under this wall, and the only one we don't know the position of is the one under the grass a bit further over.
So we found 3. We think we know where a 4th one was.
Yeah.
3.5 out of 5?
Yeah, I reckon so.
Why have we found so little of them, though?
I think that's to do with the date when they were demolished, which seems to be the late 17th century. And at that date, it was well worth recycling all the bricks, the stone, everything, and reusing them elsewhere.
Because brick was quite a valuable commodity in those days.
In the southeast of England, whereas other parts of the site, they don't bother recycling later on in the 18th century.
Because they're, by that time, manufacturing an enormous number of bricks.
Absolutely, they can buy millions of bricks from Oxfordshire or Bedfordshire or wherever. It isn't worth recycling, but at this time it is. And I think that's the reason this has gone, other places elsewhere haven't.
No one has found anything here before. Finding these 2 bits of wall give us a glimpse of another part of Henry's palace at Hampton Court. Another part of it that was lost.
Up here on the roof at Hampton Court, you get a real sense of the complexity and grandeur and sheer scale of Henry's architecture. But all that over there is down to him as well.
All around Henry's palaces, he created vast green spaces to be his private hunting grounds. Today, 500 years later, they survive even in the very centre of London as some of our finest parks.
If you love Time Team, you can become a Time Team member today. Your membership directly funds excavations like this and helps us make new programmes and so much more. Plus, you'll get ad-free viewing, behind-the-scenes access, and a host of other benefits as well. So become a member today.
Henry VIII was the most prolific builder in the history of the monarchy, but 4 of his major palaces have been lost. Even at Hampton Court Palace, the only Tudor palace left in the country, much of Henry's work has gone. Half of the palace was knocked down by William III. In this area, the tilt yard, changes over the last 400 years destroyed the tilt yard towers that had been built by Henry, but we managed to find hints of them.
It's only a tiny bit of it, but it shows that we're on the site of where this tower was.
And now we've got another incredible opportunity to find a part of Henry's palace that has been lost. Somewhere in this garden, just after the birth of his son Edward, Henry built a bowling alley. There's a plan of the palace that shows a structure here where the bowling alley was supposed to be, and it sits across these two small gardens. We know very little about Tudor bowling alleys, so we've got lots of questions about how they were constructed and what they look like.
This long structure sort of reaching out into the gardens is one of two of the bowling alleys that Henry had at Hampton Court. So it shows how it ties in to the range behind us that was Prince Edward's lodgings, and then sort of runs past the tennis court here, which is another building just behind us.
So the $64,000 question, John, is can you see that on the geophysics?
What do you mean, can we see it? Look at Jimmy's radar results. They're absolutely fantastic. There's the wall line showing clearly. And look, these little blobs, those are the actual buttresses surviving.
Our first trench in this rear garden will try to find the end of the building. But in the front garden, where we opened a large trench against the existing garden wall, we've got a bit of a result.
Dan, you seem to have uncovered quite a lot of brick.
Indeed, yes. 3 different layers of it, the top one being the 18th century garden wall, an offset with a similar date, but more interestingly, this piece of wall underneath, where the bricks are a lot smaller and appear to be Tudor.
Now that is intriguing, isn't it? Wouldn't it be nice if we actually found the wall of the bowling alley right under the garden wall?
Well, it's on the right alignment anyway, because we know it comes off that building at the back.
One side of the bowling alley seems to be under this garden wall. What we have to do now is find the other side. Bowling was very popular in Tudor times. Henry himself built several alleys, and as he loved to gamble on games, that probably included bowling. But none survive, and the only picture is this one. It shows a long, narrow building with what looks like a small room at the end.
We don't actually know how the Tudors played bowls. The alleys themselves seem to have sloping sides to them, possibly so that you could roll a ball and it could overtake the one in front to get to the skittles at the end. At the far end, was there a place where servants could wait and then jump into the alley and set up the skittles again? It's a very strange sport. So I think it's particularly interesting to try and unravel the structure of the building, because the structure of the building is one of the ways where we might be able to understand how this pretty bizarre Tudor sport was actually played.
After another day's worth of digging, we've got the other wall. And it's a big one.
When I was last here, Mick, this was a tiny little trench which you were going to project that way in order to find the other wall of the bowling alley.
Well, that's right, and another wall that's shown on the map. And so we did that. We're pretty sure that wall is on top of one side, and we came across this wall here. And this would have joined onto the building at the back. But there's a problem with this piece of wall here.
Which is what?
On the 18th century plan, it's shown with buttresses along it.
There's no buttresses there, are there?
No, and we've opened enough of a length to see if there would have been. So that sort of threw us into a bit of a conundrum. Was this actually the bowling alley wall or not?
Yeah.
So come and look at this over here. Because we got Dan to project the line through here.
The line of that wall?
The line of that wall, which you see at the back, and you see in front of him there.
Oh, buttress.
Yeah, on a chalk block foundation, and then what's the interval down between them?
It's about 2 metres.
So 2 metres that way, look. Look down that hole.
Oh, come and have a look. Buttress City, we've got another one. So this definitely is the bowling alley?
So it's definitely the bowling alley. It's going that way. If you go and look over the wall, up that ladder there.
You serious?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You look over the wall, you'll see the rest of it. Got your crampons with you? I must resist the temptation to go and pull the ladder away.
Hi, Faye. What you got over in your trench then?
Well, we've got a continuation of the wall you've got in your garden running all the way through here. We haven't got the end of it yet. I mean, it's at least 60 metres long at the moment.
60 metres for a bowling alley? Mick, can we really believe that Henry chucked his bowls 60 metres?
Well, they must have had lots of strong arm muscles to do that, mustn't they?
It's rare to find evidence of a bowling alley. They've all disappeared. So finding this tells us a lot more about them. At 60 metres, this bowling alley was 3 times the length of the alleys we use today for 10-pin bowling. It must have been a very different game from what we think of as bowling. Maybe they played it in stages. The bowling alley was one of the last parts of Hampton Court to be built by Henry. His building work here was largely finished by the end of the 1530s. By any standards, Hampton Court is and was an impressive size. But it was nowhere close to being the size of the largest palace Henry ever built, here at Whitehall in the centre of London. In 1530, around the time he was building the Great Hall at Hampton Court, Henry began work on Whitehall Palace. His work here was to last for the rest of his life. He probably never saw it without scaffolding on it.
Whitehall Palace was a joint project between Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. And amazingly, we still have the accounts to this very day of large sheets of paper being delivered to them at Greenwich. And they undoubtedly sat down with a pen and with these large sheets of paper and sketched out what it was they wanted to have built. And the royal workmen turned that into proper construction drawings, and off they went. So I think something that is very, very important to remember about Henry VIII in this new enthusiastic phase he has, he is a hands-on patron. He's not handing it over to an architect to deal with it. He himself is specifying precisely what it was he wanted to live in.
Whitehall Palace covered most of the area occupied by Whitehall today. On this side of the road was the living quarters. Across here, in what's now Horse Guards Parade Ground, was the fun part.
This was the tilt yard. This is where they held tournaments. So from just behind me, right the way up there, more or less up to Trafalgar Square, was where people got on their horses and thundered up and down with their javelins and their lances.
And over here?
This was what you might call the recreation centre, the entertainment complex.
It still is, it's Downing Street.
Well, you're right. I mean, just to the left of where 10 Downing Street is there, you had the tennis courts, you had 4 tennis courts, you had a bowling alley, there is a cockpit for cockfighting, and there are sort of ornamental gardens and a whole series of galleries.
On the edge of what was the tilt yard here sits what's now St James's Park. And that too was once part of Henry's palace at Whitehall.
It's quite easy when you think of these palaces just to think of the buildings, the bricks and mortar in the middle, but of course they were actually just a sort of pinprick in the middle of a huge area of land. Huge chunks of London still belong to the Crown Estate, belong to the royal parks, simply because Henry VIII put them there when he was building this huge landed buffer zone around his palaces. Part of it was just status. If you had a huge royal palace, you wanted to set it in huge landholdings. And that's really what Henry VIII was doing. He wanted to be able to get on his horse and to be able to ride for 10 miles on his own land.
This is part of Henry's legacy to us. Around all his palaces, he left us big open spaces that we can all enjoy today, even in the centre of London. The palace at Whitehall is gone. There's nothing left on the ground, but there is under the ground, in a basement underneath the Ministry of Defence building.
And what you're actually going to see is his wine cellar.
Oh, look at that. Look, come down here. That is quite extraordinary. But Simon, if this was just the wine cellar and it looked so spectacular, what was the rest of the place like?
Every single room here was designed specifically to try and emphasise Henry VIII's wealth, his taste, his power, his influence, his piety, whatever it might be.
But if you and I had been peasants at that time, well, you wouldn't, but I might have, would we have thought, oh, wow, this is incredibly modern?
Well, for a start, you wouldn't have got in here, so you wouldn't have had a chance to do that. You might have walked through the street and you would have looked from the outside, and what you would have seen would have been a sort of fantasy building. It would have been covered in gilded vanes and flags, and the outside of the brickwork would have been painted. The brickwork wasn't just left to look like brick, it was painted red, and the joints were painted white on the outside of it. The windows were brightly painted, they all had stained glass in. So Whitehall Palace was very, very bright. It was very magnificent. It was a fantasy building. It was like something out of Tales of Chivalry, out of the court of King Arthur.
Whitehall was a fantasy building. It was the biggest palace in Europe. Henry wanted his European neighbours to understand just how powerful he was. He saw himself up there with the great emperors in Rome. At Hampton Court, Wolsey installed these terracotta roundels on the walls to remind us who was in charge. Decorating a building in this way was drawn from the latest fashion that was sweeping Europe, from the great Italian Renaissance, from Florence and Rome. The Italians had the inspiration and the craft skills. Henry wanted what they had.
When we talk about Henry and his relationship with Rome, we tend to see things in a pretty straightforward way. Henry had a row with the Pope, split with Rome, and started the Church of England. Except that actually things were much more complex than that. Henry started out as a big fan of Rome. He even wrote a book called In Defence of the Seven Sacraments, which basically said the Pope was absolutely right and Martin Luther was completely wrong.
Many of the ideas the Tudors used in their buildings came from here and from Florence.
The mind of the Tudor designer was incredibly greedy. What they wanted to do was suck in influences from all over the place. And they turned to classical mythology and the Bible, and they mixed them with the influences that were beginning to come from the Italian Renaissance.
Just a few hundred metres from the Vatican, a nondescript building sits off to one side. This was known as the Palazzo Inglese, the English palace. This building belonged to Henry VIII. The Tudors were in the heart of Rome and loving what they saw. So they stole ideas where they could.
Classicising Italian style was cutting edge. It's clearly linked with images of overwhelming power. Roman emperors, the Roman Empire. If you want to compare yourself with a great ruler from the past, Constantine, for Henry in his later phases when he's thinking of himself as a great Christian ruler who's revivifying the church in England, all those parallels come very naturally.
One thing the Italians were doing was decorating the outside of their buildings. Much of the work was very intricate and fancy. It appealed to Henry.
Up to this time, about 1490, the Florentines had been playing with systems of ornament, classical ornament, on the facades of their palaces. But here, it's introduced to Rome, and it covers the facade of this marble palace with the sort of decoration that you actually find for the first time in England in the buildings of Henry VIII's courtiers. Hampton Court Stores is full of demolished bits of terracotta, just like that.
The terracotta roundels at Hampton Court are a great example of this, and they're busts of Roman emperors, so they're paragons of rule. It's a very humanist thing to look back to these classical examples of emperors who ruled fairly. The symbol of them is Henry is a great ruler, and Wolsey puts them there to suggest that.
Where Henry led, others followed. Henry's interest in the Italian Renaissance meant others began to decorate their buildings in a similar way. This is Lea Marney Tower, just a few miles from Beaulieu Palace. Lord Marney had been with Henry at the Field of Cloth of Gold. He saw the magnificent palace there with its decorated exterior, so he did the same thing here himself and went mad with decorated stucco in an Italian style. And at Acton Court, built for Henry's 3-day visit in 1535, the owner probably even hired in workmen from Henry's court to decorate the inside in an Italian style he knew would please the king. The intention was to be magnificent.
For him and for other Renaissance princes, magnificence was the key to success. If you had it, you flaunted it. Magnificence bespoke your power, your political ascendancy, and so the more magnificent you appeared, the more people would take you seriously as a ruler.
Henry's sense of the magnificent didn't just come to him late in life, though. Even in his early 20s, he appreciated the beautiful and insisted on things being done in a grand manner. And to see that properly, we need to go back to Beaulieu Palace, the palace he built when he was just 25. We've got a theory we want to test, and to do that, we need to find the chapel. Which means digging up the school's car park. Let's hope it's there.
If you're enjoying this episode, join us as a Patreon member today.
At the site of Beaulieu Palace in Essex, we're digging the chapel built by Henry VIII. We're finding huge Tudor walls, and we know that the chapel was big. Just how big can be seen here. On the right's Westminster Abbey, next to it is St Margaret's Church. And this window was originally in the chapel at Beaulieu. Beaulieu Palace was the first palace built by Henry VIII. It was cutting edge in its day. The latest designs were making their way here from Europe in books on architecture, like this one, which Jonathan discovered in Oxford. This volume contains a book by an Italian architect called Alberti. It was essentially a book on how to build palaces.
So he begins by saying, right, here's an architect, this is his job, and the way that he should conceive a building, according to Book 1, is through lineaments. And what he means by, there we are, lineamentis, liber primus, on lines. And lines are all about sitting down with a clean sheet of paper or parchment and drawing out on site the outlines of your building to achieve clarity on the ground.
But can you say that any of the principles in here actually influence the building of Henry's palaces?
A surveyor called William Bolton comes on the scene in about 1503, and he's a surveyor on Henry VII's Chapel, on Hampton Court, on Beaulieu, and then on the Field of Cloth of Gold. Every one of those is designed according to perfect squares. Alberti's principles in Chapter 1 seem to have been understood by the British court, and they've taken this to heart.
And back at Beaulieu, built by Bolton, we can see evidence of this thinking.
One of our targets this week has been to find the chapel, and by the look of it, Jonathan, you're bang on the money.
It's amazing, isn't it? A vast building, this one, walls about 5 feet thick, and we're on the corner of the chapel, the southeast corner where it meets the vestry, and that great chunk of brickwork in there is the platform for the altar, so we're right under the east window.
Built in 1517, this chapel shows just how early Henry adopted European thinking. These walls continue and they meet with the gatehouse. Renaissance design hit Essex, and it was the surveyor William Bolton who was responsible.
The main principle is organising an entire site with geometry.
And what's the geometry?
Well, he uses a square. He sets that down first, and then he rotates it to give you an 8-pointed star, and within that shape he draws a second square, and that then gives you the width of each of the ranges that surrounds this courtyard and the direction of everything that comes off it. You can see at the top there.
So our trench here and the gatehouse are linked by that geometry. We're standing here on that part, and over there at the apex of the corner of the square is the gatehouse.
Exactly. In fact, it skims the angle of the gatehouse turrets themselves. The point is that Bolton regularises the heart of the thing with this geometry. And that purity, that rationality, that order is exactly what a monarch could want to be represented by.
Henry's lost palaces were all built along similar lines. Beaulieu was built around the idea of perfect squares. So was the palace at the Field of Cloth of Gold, as was Hampton Court, a classically simple idea brought over here from Europe by the Renaissance king, Henry. And with his last great palace, Henry's embrace of the Renaissance seems to leave traditional Tudor way behind.
In the year 1538, Henry's love of classical European Renaissance architecture reached a brand new level. At last he'd had a son called Edward, and once Edward was born, Henry embarked on building a new palace, which was defined as much by its name as anything else. It was called Nonsuch Palace, which meant palace beyond compare. It was the smallest of his palaces. It had no great hall, no large public chapel, But it was arguably his finest work, and it looked extraordinary.
The most magnificent was Nonsuch. We can tell that from the designs. That would have been extraordinary. It was based on this Italian Renaissance style of architecture and interior decoration, and it would have that would have been the most magnificent of his palaces. It's a great shame we don't have that.
Nonsuch Palace was here in Surrey. In 1959, even before Time Team was around, this was the site of the biggest public archaeological dig ever held in this country. Martin Biddle led the dig.
It must have been the most extraordinary place to dig. And were you just here for one summer?
Yes, we did it in 10 flaming weeks of 1959. Over 100 people were digging. You know, we had 75,000 visitors to the excavation.
Oh, gosh.
And it was treated as if it was a Romano-British house, very thoroughly stratigraphic and very carefully controlled.
Nonsuch was clearly Henry's last great burst of Italianate decoration. And what's spectacular about it was the inner courtyard with these giant stucco figures, of which only fragments now survive.
Right, so we're now at the inner gatehouse. We're going to walk up 8 steps into the inner court. Now, if we stood here as a visitor, what we would see rising high on the wall facing us, the wall of the South Range, will be a great stucco figure of Henry VIII with the young son Edward by his side.
Golly.
And at the top they have the images of empire, the 32 Roman emperors. Then below that, on the king's side, the gods, the great figures of classical antiquity, and on the queen's side, the goddesses.
Very fitting.
Biddle and his team found the building's outline, and they came across incredible finds. Over 1,500 fragments of stucco panels, nearly 1,000 pieces of carved and gilded slate, and 6,000 fragments of decorated plaster, all of which had been fixed onto the building's walls. Nonsuch looked amazing with all its fancy adornment. This was the Italian Renaissance gone mad. It was Henry's swan song. There's one surviving palace that looks like Nonsuch would have looked. This is Palazzo Spada in Rome.
Cool. It's a bit dramatic, isn't it?
It's amazing. It's really architecture as theatre. It's built into the 1540s, so actually it's a little later than Nonsuch.
Yes.
But this is typical of where Roman classical palace design gets to. It's covered in stucco of the gods inside and emperors outside. There are gods like Venus up there, and there's Mars there with the sword. There's a whole encyclopedia. But Hercules is really popular in palace design because everyone wants to be him. It's like wearing your favourite football shirt. Fabulous.
When you say this is the next best thing to Nonsuch, would Nonsuch actually have looked like this?
If you take the size of this courtyard, it's about the same as each of Nonsuch's 2 courtyards, and the height's about the same as well. But if you were in the middle of Nonsuch, you'd have seen stucco work like this, exceptional in England for its date. And it shows you exactly what we lost when Nonsuch was demolished.
But it doesn't look Tudor.
It doesn't look typically Tudor, but that's because we're used to what happens to survive. And when you pick apart the archaeological evidence for the materials, the craftsmanship, the very different approaches to Tudor building, we realise that we really don't have the full picture, and that's the value of archaeology.
Statues like these also adorned Nonsuch's walls. This is where Henry saw himself, at the heart of figures like this, alone among the gods and the emperors.
These classical figures were thought to be figures of power. And at long last, Edward has been born to Henry as a son to continue the Tudor dynasty. So Henry and Edward are amongst the gods and the goddesses and the emperors and the liberal arts and virtues. The whole thing is a massive dynastic statement. It's a statement of hope for the future of the dynasty, statement about the status of the dynasty, and it's the greatest piece of propaganda ever erected by any English ruler.
Propaganda and realpolitik? Or was it just plain fantasy? Which of these worlds did Henry live in? Well, he lived in both.
This painting is the perfect example of how Henry wanted to present himself, surrounded by his loving wife and children. This is his daughter, the future Queen Mary. This is his son and heir, Edward. This is his other daughter, the future Queen Elizabeth. And this is his wife, Jane Seymour. Except this painting could never have happened like this because Jane died while giving birth to Edward. It's not real. It's the world as Henry wanted it to be.
Deciphering Henry's world isn't easy. Just when you think you're right, you might not be. We know that this background is Whitehall Palace. Or is it?
The difficulty about Henry VIII's palaces is that so few of them survive. So we don't really know what Whitehall looked like. We don't really know what Greenwich looked like. We don't really know what Richmond looked like. And so when we look at Nonsuch, which is actually one of the better documented ones, it's very tempting to say, oh, isn't this fantastic? This is out of the ordinary. This is very unusual. But we don't know. We do know that some of the same people who worked on Nonsuch worked at Whitehall. And it would be surprising if a palace that was almost certainly built for his son and heir was more magnificent than the principal palace of the realm at Whitehall. So I think what we can say about Nonsuch is that it was absolutely the latest style, but it's very, very likely that big chunks of Whitehall Palace in particular were very, very similar.
Seeing Nonsuch throws all our ideas about Tudor building up in the air. But then there's almost nothing left of most of Henry's palaces. Even at Hampton Court, much of his work was replaced by William III. What we do have left there gives us a glimpse of Henry's world. Henry's legacy to us is big open spaces and grandiose architectural statements. The Great Hall and the interiors hint at the splendour. The roundels hint at the Renaissance. Hampton Court shows Henry as a man of power, an intellectual who studied the Renaissance and imported it here. And most of all, we see a man who was determined to impress his subjects and the world with his importance and his own magnificence. Join Time Team on Patreon to access exclusive 3D models, masterclasses, and behind-the-scenes insights.